Hi there, world history students. We're continuing unit number 5, European Imperialism, with section number 5, which focuses on what is today the country of South Africa. Now, the reason why we're sort of finishing up our look at European imperialism in Africa with a look at South Africa in particular is that South Africa's story is rather unique. They had not one, but two European powers who were messing around with their business during the period of imperialism, and one very powerful native African nation, the Zulu, as well, who were all sort of fighting for control over South Africa. And as a result of that struggle for control, South Africa experienced a struggle for freedom for Native Africans that continued right up until 1990. And so later in the year, we'll be coming back to South Africa because the story of how Native Africans gained their rights in South Africa is a fairly inspiring one. And it's led by a man named Nelson Mandela, who's fairly well known here in the United States. So we'll be coming back to South Africa later in the year. But in this lesson, I'll be laying the groundwork for what it was he was fighting against. So, by the end of this lesson, I hope that you're able to explain why South Africa became a land contested between three nations: the Zulu, the Afrikaners, also known as Boers, and the British. And then, hopefully, you'll be able to explain how the end of the conflict between the Afrikaners or Boers and the British led to additional oppression of Native Africans. So you can see over here the names of some of these nations. We'll talk about an event called the Great Trek. We'll talk about a couple of wars in South Africa, and finally introduce you to the policy or system of policies called apartheid, which continued in South Africa until 1990. So we're actually going to go back a little bit toward the earliest period that we've been studying during this unit, period before the year 1870, to give you some of the earliest background on how South Africa became a contested land, but then we'll continue right up through into the 20th century. So if we go back and talk about South Africa prior to the arrival of Europeans, you would see that South Africa was actually home to multiple native African nations. And so we'll be covering this at the top of page 10 in your unit packet. South Africa is located, not surprisingly, in the far southern part of Africa. So South Africa, this is about as far as the names of countries go, this one is going to help you the most in locating it on a map. So here is South Africa. Right here, oh poo, gets covered up by the little bar there, but down here is what's called the Cape of Good Hope. The Cape of Good Hope. When Portuguese explorers were trying to make their way around Africa, they originally named it the Cape of Storms because it was very difficult sailing. And the leader of Portugal, Prince Henry, who was known as Prince Henry the Navigator, said, "We're not going to call that the Cape of Storms. None of our navigators are ever going to want to go there again. We want to get around Africa and get to India and trade." And so they renamed it the Cape of Good Hope. And it's still known as the Cape of Good Hope today. Today, the largest city in South Africa, one of the largest cities in South Africa is Cape Town, and that's located on the Cape of Good Hope. And that's also where the story of European intrusion into South Africa begins. But first, let's talk about the native African nations who existed there before any Europeans arrived. There were multiple nations who were sort of struggling for control of this territory. You have the three largest, which were the Khoikhoi, the Basotho, and the Zulu. And the Zulu proved to be, in the end, the most dominant of the three, and essentially were successful in defeating, conquering, and ruling over the other nations of South Africa. What made them so dominant? Well, they had a series of very successful and very forceful and very brilliant leaders, particularly military leaders, the most famous of whom was named Shaka, whom you see on the left. The Zulu innovated a battlefield tactic called the bull and horns. the bull and horns. And what they would do is, and this was sort of Shaka's specialty on the battlefield, he would select his fastest, swiftest soldiers, the ones who could run the fastest, and he would place them on the two flanks or sides of his army, on the left and on the right. He would choose his strongest warriors and place them in the center of his army. And when a battle began, as the Zulu army progressed forward across the battlefield, the soldiers in the middle, the strongest, the meanest, the toughest, they would act almost like a bulldozer that was going to roll you over with their sheer might. In the meantime, he would launch the two horns, right? So they were the bull, right? Then the two horns were the two flanks, the left and the right sides of the army, who were the fastest warriors. He would launch them in this sort of lightning shot across the battlefield to get around and even behind the enemy and attack them from the sides and from the rear, so that the enemy was sort of enveloped and shocked by how they were being attacked. But they were essentially forced to fight on all sides at once. The other thing that the two horns did, by sort of trying to sweep around and catch the enemy from the sides or the rear, was to prevent any of them from being able to escape. So that when the bull finally arrived, the stronger soldiers in the middle, and was ready to bulldoze them over, they couldn't retreat backward and escape. So you could destroy an entire enemy army all at once. And using this tactic, the Zulu defeated, conquered, dominated the other nations of South Africa. Shaka himself was a sort of a military dictator. He ruled with absolute authority over the Zulu and over the other nations that that they had conquered. He tolerated no dissent. He tolerated no disagreement. He tolerated no rivals. Any person who sort of disagreed with him publicly was subject to be sort of tied up and beaten, or tied up and clubbed to death, usually. And so he was really like a dictator. He ruled like a dictator. Of course, that engenders fear and sort of perhaps even jealousy. And as a result of that, he was ultimately assassinated. He was assassinated by his own half-brother, Dingnane. And unfortunately for the Zulu, that led to a certain amount of dissension. It led to sort of a splintering amongst the nation over who should be the legitimate leader. And the timing of that splintering was very bad, because it was happening at a time when South Africa was increasingly coming under the control of Europeans. That is, in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And it perhaps made the Zulu less capable, or less prepared, or less unified in their efforts to defend South Africa against the encroachments by Europeans. Now, in fact, the first Europeans to arrive in South Africa and settle there and establish a colony there were the Dutch. Now, the people who are Dutch are from the Netherlands. So the Netherlands is a small country north of France. It is separated from France by Belgium. So if you're in Paris, the capital of France, and you start driving north, after about an hour and a half, the first border that you will cross over into is the Belgian border. And then you'll drive another hour or so through Belgium, and eventually you cross over into the border of the Netherlands. And the people who live in the Netherlands are called Dutch. And in the 1600s, the Dutch were certainly one of the most powerful European countries that there was. And it's hard to believe, because it's a tiny little country. But the Dutch had built up a mighty navy, not quite the equivalent of the British Navy, but they were actually Britain's chief rivals for naval power. And the Dutch actually began building a kind of a worldwide empire. Again, not equal to the British Empire, but the Dutch had colonies here in North America. As a matter of fact, New York, including New York City, was originally settled by the Dutch. And then on the other hand, on the other side of the world, Indonesia, the island country of Indonesia, was not originally, but was in the 1600s and moving into the 20th century, a colony of the Netherlands as well, a Dutch colony. So the Netherlands looks small on a map, but they were exercising an enormous amount of power, naval power, commercial power, in trade, financial power, in banking, and political power as they built up this mini British Empire. So they were actually the first Europeans to settle in South Africa. They arrived on the coast of South Africa at Cape of Good Hope and established a small colony, which they called simply the Cape Colony. And at first, the thinking was that the Cape Colony would simply serve as a kind of a halfway point between the Netherlands in Europe and their colonies in what are today Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, over in the Pacific. But they found that that the soil and the climate were good for farming. Well, again, you say, well, this is that South Africa where it's desert and scrub. But this is also that part of South Africa where certain portions, particularly on the west coast, lend themselves well to certain kinds of farming because the air currents and the ocean currents bring a rainy season that provides enough moisture that you can farm there. And so discovering that the land was good for farming, the Dutch actually settled there. Instead of simply making it a way station or a halfway point for their ships, they began to settle there and establish plantations. Now, those Dutch who settled in South Africa became known as Afrikaners. Now, you say, well, they're Dutch. They are Dutch. But do you remember when we were talking in the 19th century nationalism unit, we talked about how people who were Spanish in their ancestry, but who lived in Spain's colonies in the Americas, had a sort of a special name. They were known as criollos or creoles. Well, similarly, Dutch, who were of Dutch ancestry, but they had settled in Africa, and those generations who were Dutch ancestry but born in Africa were known as Afrikaners. So just as a Spanish person born in the Americas was called a criollo or creole, a Dutch person born in Africa was called an Afrikaner. They even developed kind of their own variant of the Dutch language called Afrikaans. Another name that was given to these Dutch living in South Africa was Boer. Boer is the Dutch word for farmer, and many of the Afrikaners referred to themselves that way, as Boers, farmers, because they had established plantations in South Africa. Now, here was the thing, just like plantations in North America, the ones in South Africa, in South America and the Caribbean too, the ones in South Africa relied on slave labor because they were producing crops that required a lot of labor. They relied on slavery. Where did they get the slaves? Well, they traded for the slaves with the Zulu. Remember that in Africa, slavery was practiced as a form of, it was practiced in a different way than Europeans practiced slavery. Slaves were prisoners of war, and they were enslaved by the community of the nation that had conquered them and taken them as prisoners. But when the Europeans arrived, they began to purchase slaves from those nations that had conquered other nations and taken slaves as prisoners. And that appears to be how the Afrikaners, the Dutch, or Boers, acquired slaves for their plantations. They traded with the Zulu. They traded guns and other European manufactured goods to the Zulu. These guns helped the Zulu maintain their dominance over the other nations, and in return, the Zulu captured slaves and traded them to the Dutch. So for decades, the Dutch, the Afrikaners, the Boers, they operated their plantations using native African slave labor. And they had a stable partnership with the Zulu. They did not make war against the Zulu. The Afrikaners largely stayed on the west coast, which is where the good farmland was. The Zulus' homeland was mostly in the center and in the east, and so they didn't encroach on each other's territory. They had a trade partnership, and so relationship between the Afrikaners and the Zulu was a fairly stable one. Okay, now we're moving to the bottom of page 10, and here's where everything began to change. But in 1805, the British moved in. The British, I think, The British are always looking to expand their empire. Not satisfied with an empire on which the sun never sets, the British are always looking to expand that empire. And the British had had run-ins with the Dutch before. I mentioned, for example, that New York City and the whole colony of New York was originally a Dutch colony, but it ended up a British colony because the British took it from them. The Dutch were their chief rivals, and the British took New York from them. And it was actually named New York by the British. Before that, it was called New Netherland, and the city of New York was called New Amsterdam, which is the capital of the Netherlands. So the British were always sort of trying to squeeze the Dutch out of as many of their colonies as possible. And in 1805, it was Cape Colony's turn, South Africa's turn. So the British conquered the Afrikaners and took control of the Cape Colony. So you see that here on the map. You see on this little map of South Africa, this is sort of represented now as part of the British Empire. Cape Colony, part of the British Empire. And you can see that this is the extent of Cape Colony. Zulu homeland was more up here in the eastern part of what is today South Africa, and then other Native African nations were they represented the space in between, but the Zulu dominated these other nations. Well, when the British first took over Cape Colony, they and the Afrikaners did fairly well in terms of their relations with each other. Remember that the British approach in general was, when they took over an area, to let the local people govern themselves as much as possible. So long as they didn't sort of defy the British, so long as they kept themselves in alignment with British policy, the British let the people whom they conquered, the nations whom they conquered, largely govern themselves, making up a lot of their own mind about laws and how they should be administered, things like that. So for the first couple of decades, maybe the first 3 decades, first 30 years that Britain controlled the Cape Colony, their relationship with the Afrikaners was fine. But that all changed in 1833. In 1833, Great Britain became the first country in the world to abolish slavery. There was an anti-slavery movement in Britain, an abolitionist movement in Britain that finally prevailed in 1833 when Britain passed a law, its parliament passed a law abolishing slavery throughout the British Empire. That, of course, included South Africa. But remember, the Afrikaners relied on slavery as labor for their plantations. So when the British abolished slavery, the Afrikaners saw that as a disaster. They saw that as something that was going to ruin them. They weren't going to be able to maintain their plantations, they felt, without the slave labor of Native Africans. Remember that this was the kind of issue that helped trigger the Civil War in our country. When Abraham Lincoln was elected, people in the South were convinced that Lincoln was going to abolish slavery. And they felt that their personal economies, their plantation economy, would be ruined without slavery. And so what did they do? Well, here in the United States, those southern states seceded, and that was the beginning of the Civil War. In South Africa, the story is similar, but not the same. In South Africa, when the British government actually did abolish slavery in 1833, so the British did this 32 years before the United States did. When the British government abolished slavery in 1833, the Afrikaners, or Boers, who felt they would be ruined by the abolition of slavery, they kind of seceded from Cape Colony, but they did it in a very different way. They packed up all their things. They packed up all their belongings, all their property, and they left. And they headed north. And all of these little routes that you see here are the northern routes that the various Afrikaner communities took in what was known as the Great Trek. So trek is the Dutch word for a journey or a voyage. This is the Great Trek. And the Great Trek was an effort by the Afrikaners to escape from British authority, to to relocate their communities farther north and get out from under British authority. Because in a place like South Africa, the British could only control so much of the territory. As you can see here, this entire sort of gray space is the modern country of South Africa. But British authority really only applied here in Cape Colony. The British didn't really have authority beyond that. They couldn't control. This was sort of like the Wild West out here. And so the Great Trek was an effort by the Afrikaners to escape from the control of the British by moving north into other parts of South Africa beyond the boundaries within which the British actually exercised authority. And that's what they did. They relocated north. The British essentially allowed them to go. The British looked at the Great Trek and said, well, good, if they want to practice slavery, we don't want them here anyway. And now we won't have to deal with them. And so for the first few decades after the Great Trek, there were no real problems. Everybody kind of had their own space in South Africa. The British had the Cape Colony, which along the coast with the best agricultural land satisfied them. The Voortrekkers, the Great Trekkers, the Afrikaners, the Boers, they had now taken over a lot of the center of South Africa and were beginning to reestablish their communities there. That was fine. And then the Zulu had their area in which they were dominant in the east, and they controlled the other native African nations. So everybody kind of had their own little zone or sector of South Africa. And so once again, things sort of settled down and relationships between the three nations stabilized. However, this was about to change because up in the Afrikaner part of South Africa, so up here in this part of South Africa now, some children were playing in a sort of a stream bed, a dried out stream bed. There are a lot of streams that only flow during a certain time of the year, and during the rest of the time of the year, the stream beds are dry. And so they were playing in this dried out stream bed when they noticed a sort of sparkling, bright sparkling coming from from the ground there. And they sort of cleared off and they picked up this stone that was sparkly, and they liked it. And so they took it home to their parents, and they said to their parents, "Oh, look at what we found in the stream bed." And their parents said to them, "Where did you find that?" And the kids said, "Oh, down here in the stream bed." And the parents said, "Show us," because what these children had discovered was a diamond. And diamonds are naturally occurring, but they don't naturally occur everywhere. They occur in rare pockets, which is why diamonds are so rare and therefore so expensive, so valuable. And what these children had stumbled onto turned out to be, at least as far as we know today, the largest deposit of diamonds in the world. And this is what it now looks like today. This is the Big Hole. It is the largest diamond mine in the world, and it's located near Kimberley in South Africa. The family who now took over the diamond mine, the De Beers family, and if you ever watch TV and you encounter a commercial for diamond jewelry, you might even see their name, De Beers, appear there. They now began the process of diamond mining, and other Afrikaner families as well began to locate diamond mines in South Africa. Today, South Africa is the world's largest exporter of diamonds. Not surprisingly, they operated their diamond mines through the use of slave labor. So once again, the Afrikaners exploited their relationship with the Zulus and continued to acquire slaves from them. But now, instead of working in the fields, the slaves were put to work hauling away ore, hauling away stone in the search for diamonds. And the fact that the British, remember that initially when the Great Trekkers, when the Afrikaners or Boers had moved north out of the Cape Colony, the British said, let them go. We don't want them here anyway. They're slavers. But of course, now that there were diamonds, and everyone knew that there were vast amounts of diamonds in that part of South Africa to which the great trekkers had trekked, now the British were interested again. And now the British began to try to expand their territory into the north, into the area where the diamonds were. And that forced the Afrikaners to kind of move and expand their territory. And pretty soon the Zulus just got tired of European nations, whether it was British or Afrikaners, encroaching on their territory. And so in the 1870s, the first of the major wars in South Africa erupted, and it was called the Zulu War. If you prefer, the Zulu-British War, a war between the British and the Zulus. The British, not surprisingly, underestimated the Zulus. They underestimated the Zulus' organization, they underestimated the Zulus' discipline, and even they underestimated the Zulus' armaments, because the Zulus had access to guns, which they had traded with the Afrikaners. And in the early battles of the Zulu War, the British were defeated. The Zulu defeated the British in the early battles of the Zulu War. This was a huge shock to really everyone in Europe. There was a belief that the native armies, wherever you were, whether it was Africa or India or anywhere else, were so inferior that a European army could defeat them under almost any conditions. Remember that the Europeans regarded nations in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Island as savage nations who lacked the brain power to organize themselves in such a way that they could pose a threat on the battlefield to a disciplined, trained, well-equipped European army. But the Zulu beat the British in the early battles. Now, they did not win the war. The Zulu did not win the war. In the long run, the British sent more soldiers, more artillery, and eventually they did, through superior technology and larger numbers of, yes, trained, disciplined soldiers. The British ultimately turned the tide of the war and defeated the Zulus. And then the second war that broke out was called the Boer War. It's sometimes referred to as the Boer Wars. Remember that the Afrikaners, that is the descendants of the Dutch in South Africa, they often referred to themselves and were referred to as Boers, or in the Dutch language, farmers. And so the Boer Wars then were the second round of wars, which were fought then between the British and the Afrikaners. The Afrikaners learned a lesson from the Zulu. The Zulu had tried to fight the British in traditional battles, open battles on a battlefield. And what had happened to the Zulu was that when you fought that kind of battle, you were playing into the hands of the British, because the British were better equipped and they did have better technology. And in an open battle like that, they could take advantage of that technology. So the Boers recognized that that was not the kind of battle to fight if you were going to defeat the British. And you need to remember that the Boers were not professional soldiers anyway. They were not trained soldiers. They were mostly settlers who now formed into an amateur army called a militia. The army that the British were fighting in the Boer Wars, that is, the armies that fought on behalf of the Boers or Afrikaners, were not professional soldiers. They did not have the backing of the Dutch government, for example, because South Africa was no longer a Dutch colony. These were people of Dutch ancestry, but South Africa was no longer a colony of the Dutch. So the army of the Netherlands was not involved in this. The Afrikaners were really on their own. So they formed an amateur army, a militia. And if you can think of an occasion in the past where a group of amateurs took on a professional army and were successful with it, what would be an example that you could think of? Take about 10 seconds and see if you can remember an example. Well, one example you might think about was when America's militia, the militia of the colonies that eventually became the United States, defeated the British. But a more recent example, one that we studied here in class, was the Spanish, who fought against Napoleon's armies when Napoleon invaded Spain. And if you remember, the Spanish had developed a different kind of warfare called guerrilla warfare, in which instead of allowing yourself to be drawn into traditional battles, where your opponent can take advantage of their superior numbers, their superior training, their superior technology, instead, you don't allow yourself to get drawn into traditional battles. Instead, you sort of stage ambushes, hit and run attacks, catch the enemy when they're on the march, catch the enemy when they're vulnerable, attack them, draw blood, and then scatter, disperse, and then live to fight another day. And so you maintain this sort of constant everyday harassment of your opponent until they become psychologically exhausted and you slowly drip, drip, drip away their men. That's the kind of war that the Boers, the Afrikaners, fought against the British, a guerrilla-style war. It's meant to drag the thing out and sort of slowly exhaust both the capacity of your opponent to fight and their psychological will to fight. And after a period of about 2 years of fighting, that's what happened to the British. Mostly it was psychological. The British were becoming psychologically exhausted, frustrated that they couldn't subdue the Boers. And the British public, too, was growing weary of this war. And so finally the British, they didn't lose exactly, but they preferred to compromise with the Afrikaners rather than continue to fight. And so they did come to a compromise. South Africa would continue to be part of the British Empire, but the British would allow the Boers, that is the Afrikaners, to essentially govern it. So South Africa would remain a part of Britain, remain a part of that empire of theirs, but they would leave the governing of South Africa up to the Afrikaners. Now, what that meant was that the Afrikaners could largely institute whatever laws in South Africa they saw fit, as long as those laws did not conflict with the laws of the British Empire. They would not, for example, be allowed to reinstitute slavery. The British Empire had abolished slavery. The Afrikaners, although allowed control over the government of South Africa, would not be allowed to reinstitute slavery there. So the Afrikaners did as much as they could to get as close to reinstituting slavery without actually doing it. For example, the Afrikaners passed a law that reserved most of the land in South Africa for white ownership. That is, ownership by people who are of European descent, either Afrikaners or British. Only 10% of the land in South Africa was available for ownership by Native Africans. Even though Native Africans composed well over 85% of the population, only 10% of the land was available for them to own and farm themselves. Most Africans, Native Africans in South Africa then, would be forced into positions of what's called being a tenant farmer, where you have to rent the land that you farm. They would have to rent land from white people, from Europeans, to farm the land. And generally speaking, tenant farming was a miserable way to make an existence because you would farm the land and you would produce crops and you would sell the crops, but then you would have to pay out rent to the landowner. And oftentimes, by the time you paid out rent to the landowner, there was no money left except for enough just to sort of clothe and provide shelter for your family and feed your family. It was essentially that survival wage that a factory worker would make, except you were a farmer. Now, what that meant, of course, was that most Native Africans would never have any kind of savings and would therefore never be able to afford to buy their own property, their own land. So they would be stuck as tenant farmers for the long haul. This existence, therefore, wasn't materially that much different from slavery. I mean, you were still forced to work on someone else's land, and you still only got the barest existence out of it, basic food, shelter, and clothing. And there was really no hope of ever owning any land and being free of being a tenant farmer. So in a lot of ways, by reserving 90% of the land for Europeans, the Afrikaners in control in South Africa did everything they could to reinstitute a condition of slavery without actually reinstituting slavery. The other thing that the Afrikaners did was to create laws which strictly separated or segregated Native Africans from people of European ancestry in public spaces. And this is something you may be familiar with here in the United States. You probably know the story that even after the Civil War, even after slavery was abolished, many states enacted laws called Jim Crow laws, which forced blacks and whites to be separated in public spaces. There would be separate restrooms if there were public restrooms, separate restrooms for blacks and whites, separate water fountains, separate entrances to public buildings. All of those were examples of segregation here in the United States. And that segregation continued well up into the 1960s, when the civil rights movement, led by people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, those are names I imagine you've heard of, ultimately helped to bring an end to those laws in the United States. Well, the situation was actually quite similar in South Africa. Laws segregating, that is separating Native Africans from people of European ancestry, were implemented by the South Afrikaner government. So here's a woman you see on a park bench, and it says Europeans only. And that was true of all public facilities in South Africa. And that was the beginnings. These two sets of laws were the beginnings of a system called apartheid. And apartheid continued in South Africa into the 1990s. And into 1990 was when it was finally abolished. And during that period, in between the beginning of apartheid and the end of apartheid, the laws only grew more intense. And while the United States was finally beginning to move away from our segregation laws in the 1960s, in South Africa, those laws were only becoming more strict and more pervasive and more abusive. And as I said, they continued for another 30 years. Even after the United States abolished these laws, South Africa continued. And so that then brings us into the 20th century and begins to move us into the direction of the story in which Native Africans, led by Nelson Mandela and others, were able to eventually eliminate apartheid and bring about change in South Africa. But again, that's a story for a different lesson when we get into the 20th century. But for now, we've set the stage for that story. In South Africa, due to this rather strange interaction of two different European groups, first the Afrikaners, then the British, South Africa ended up with Afrikaner rule and a system of apartheid that approximated slavery, even after slavery itself had been abolished. So that will bring an end to our little study of European imperialism in Africa. And in future lessons, we'll move to Asia, looking at India and China and Japan. So for now, take care of yourselves, stay healthy and stay safe. I look forward to teaching you again soon. Goodbye, everyone.